Thank you. Well, let me start by saying my birthday was last Friday. You can hold your wishes and applause for the end of the class. But from my daughter, I got a drawing, if you can see that without the glare of my light. And my wife took this out and got it framed. So I have this caricature of President Truman with his, I guess that's a Douglas MacArthur hat on, that she copied off of a cartoon from the time that we're going to talk about today. So I thought I'd share that with all of you. You can see that. Can you see that, Lori?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So anyway, I thought that was pretty neat. My wife ran off to Hobby Lobby and got it framed in one day. So we're going to hang that here in the study. Well, I usually start off with a review. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip that today and move right to today's lecture. And for most of you who weren't on here, we were talking about the Spark YouTube channel. If for some reason you missed part or all of last week's class, or you want to review what we talked about last week, you can go to the YouTube channel and you can view the lecture on that location. And if you don't have the link or the connection piece to that, I'm sure Lori will share that with you again. So off we go. I'm going to call this lecture Major Events in 1948, although I will talk a fair amount about the context of what led to some of those major events. So here we go. Beyond the things that President Truman did or said in 1947, 1948, we've already talked about, what other things happened in 48 which impacted the public's perception of Harry Truman, and as a result, the campaign and ultimately the general election that was upcoming in November. So I'm calling this first part Foreign Policy, Setting the Stage and Context. As I've described in some detail in earlier Truman classes, Europe was devastated by years of conflict during World War II. Millions of people had been killed or wounded. Industrial and residential centers in England, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Belgium, and elsewhere lay in ruins. Much of Europe was on the brink of famine as agricultural production had been disrupted by war. Transportation infrastructure was in shambles. The only major power in the world whose infrastructure was not destroyed or significantly damaged by the war was the United States. After breaking the Nazi siege of Stalingrad in late January of 1943, Soviet forces pushed westward out of the Soviet Union, fighting against German forces that had invaded the USSR in June of 1941, driving the Nazis from areas they had conquered and occupied, and then occupying and essentially imposing police state conditions in the countries it liberated from the Nazis. Pursuant to Truman's interpretation of the agreements reached by the Big Three allies at Yalta in February of 1945, the Truman administration sought to gain the cooperation of the USSR in providing access and transparency to the West, to the countries occupied by the Soviets, with a focus on Poland, and allowing a democratic process with free and open elections to establish new governments in the countries which the Soviet Union was occupying in Central and Eastern Europe, without success. As the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill said in his famous speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri on March the 5th, 1945, quoting from the speech here, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." He was referring, of course, to an iron curtain that had been drawn along the geographic boundary by the actions of the USSR, basically enveloping everything east of what became West Germany behind the curtain he described. It became clear to President Truman that Stalin and the USSR did not share any philosophical or ideological ideals or goals in common with the United States about post-war Europe. Stalin and the USSR demonstrated no interest at all in the rebuilding and reconstruction of devastated Europe or the rebuilding and reconstruction of the world economy. Truman concluded that the USSR and Stalin were simply interested in established domination and control over any country or geographical area that was unable to resist them. The place where the competing interests and ideology of the US and the USSR came closest to meeting head on was the defeated country of Germany and its capital city, Berlin. Germany and Berlin were divided into 4 zones of occupation at the end of the war in Europe, which evolved in time into a Western zone and an Eastern zone in both Germany, the country, and Berlin, the city, with the Western powers, the US, Great Britain, and France, occupying the Western zone in each case, and the USSR occupying and controlling the Eastern zone. It became clear with regard to post-war Germany, which over time the US concluded had to be rebuilt for the European economy to be restored, that the clear policy of the USSR was the subjugation and punishment of any part of Germany it occupied or controlled for what it had done in World War II. From the Soviet standpoint, that would best be accomplished by having dominion and control over all of Berlin and all of Germany, something that Truman was not willing to allow to happen. So let's review the policy of containment, the Truman Doctrine. As a result of the actions of the USSR and Truman's dealings with the highest level of leadership of the USSR, Truman and his administration proceeded on the assumption that the Soviets would seek to exploit, advance into, and/or seek to exert control over any areas where they perceived weaknesses in the local governments that they could exploit to their advantage. The assumption was that the communist government of the USSR was intent on world conquest and/or domination and control, and would exploit each and every opportunity it saw to pursue that ultimate goal. It's important to keep that assumption in mind in trying to understand what Truman and the Truman administration did. Truman was pushed to make a decision on how to deal with the Soviets and their agents most directly when Great Britain announced in February of 1947 that as of March the 31st, 1947, it would no longer provide military and economic assistance to the Greek government in its civil war against the Greek Communist Party. Great Britain also announced that it would no longer be able to provide aid and assistance to the country of Turkey, which that slide that you're looking at right now points out. Motivated by the British announcement, on March the 12th, 1947, President Truman appeared before a joint session of Congress and announced in that speech a new foreign policy for the United States. In his 18-minute speech, he stated, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free people to work out their own destinies in their own way. I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and orderly political processes." This was a new and assertive foreign policy announced by Truman, which announced what became called the policy of containment. This policy became known as the Truman Doctrine. He and others in his administration, particularly in the State Department, were heavily influenced in the development of the policy of containment, which emerged towards the USSR by the writings of Ambassador George Kennan, particularly his long telegram, which was sent by Kennan from Moscow to the State Department on February the 22nd, 1946, and Kinnon's subsequent anonymous article in July of 1947 in Foreign Affairs magazine entitled "The Sources of Soviet Conduct," which was published under the pseudonym X. In addition, for a request for aid and assistance to Greece, Truman also asked Congress to provide assistance for Turkey, since that nation, too, had previously been dependent on British aid and was being pressured to grant the Soviet Union unrestricted access to the Turkish Straits, the Dardanelles, and the Bosphorus, through which all ships transiting from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea must pass. On May the 22nd, 1947, Truman signed a bill that Congress had passed to contain the spread of communism by providing economic and military assistance to Greece and Turkey, marking this the first direct implementation of what became known as the Truman Doctrine. It was this policy and the actions of the Truman administration toward the Soviet Union consistent with this policy that Henry A. Wallace and his supporters opposed. This was the great divide, so to speak, between the thinking of Harry Truman and the thinking of Henry Wallace. This was the ideological split behind Wallace's third-party candidacy in 1948. The Truman Doctrine and its implementation was one of the things that the Truman administration thought was not only the right thing to do, but one the American people should and would support. So that's the context behind the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment. Let's move next to what was known technically as a European Recovery Plan, also known as the Marshall Plan. From 1945 through 1947, the United States was already assisting European economic recovery with direct financial aid. In January of 1947, President Truman appointed George Marshall to be Secretary of State. Writing in his diary on January the 8th, 1947, Truman wrote, "Marshall is the greatest man of World War II. He managed to get along with Roosevelt, the Congress, Churchill, the Navy, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he made a grand record in China. When I asked him to be my special envoy to China, he merely said, 'Yes, Mr. President, I'll go.' No argument, only patriotic action. And if any man was entitled to balk and ask for a rest, he was. We'll have a real State Department now." That's what Harry Truman wrote in his diary. In just a few short months, the State Department under Marshall crafted the European Recovery Plan concept, which George Marshall shared with the world in a speech on June the 5th of 1947 at Harvard. Officially known as the European Recovery Program, or the ERP, the Marshall Plan was intended to rebuild the economies and spirits of Western Europe primarily, although as Marshall said in his speech, "It is hard for Americans to comprehend the plight and consequent reaction of the long-suffering peoples of Europe and the effect of those reactions on their governments." He identified the real problem in Europe as, quote, "the dislocation of the entire fabric of the European economy," close quote. He did not, that is Marshall in his speech, he did not differentiate between the countries of Western and Eastern Europe, or even the Soviet Union in his speech. This was intentional. Commercial ties, private institutions, banks, insurance companies, and shipping companies had disappeared as a result of the war in Europe. He further described the breakdown, including loss of confidence in local currencies, and the withdrawal of fields from cultivation, creating food shortages. As a result of their inability to provide for their needs, European countries and their governments were being required to spend scarce foreign money on necessities from abroad. Europe's needs for the next 3 or 4 years vastly exceeded her ability to pay. And without substantial additional help, she faces economic, social, and political deterioration of a very grave character. The remedy, Marshall said, lies in breaking the vicious cycle and restoring the confidence of the European people in the economic future of their own countries and of Europe as a whole. Given the obvious consequence to the economy of the United States of the failure to break this cycle, it was only logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in this crisis. I've been paraphrasing from Marshall's speech. Quoting now from Ben Steele's 2018 book, The Marshall Plan, Dawn of the Cold War. Now I'm quoting Steele. In a now famous line in his Harvard speech, Marshall stated, "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." The phrase had been crafted so as to mark the Soviets, if they rejected the plan, as partisans of hunger, poverty, and chaos. Marshall continued in his speech. Its purpose, the European Recovery Program, its purpose would be the revival of a working economy in the world, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. That is, the policy was not directed against the only country it could have been directed against, the Soviet Union, but toward, not negatively stated, but positively stated, toward the advancement internationally of the free institutions which the country, that is the Soviet Union, opposed as a matter of ideology. Then in Marshall's first statement in his speech to elicit a reaction from those who were assembled, he said, "Any government that is willing to assist in the task of recovery will find full cooperation, I am sure, on the part of the United States government. Any government which maneuvers to block the recovery of other countries cannot expect help from us." Furthermore, governments, political parties, or groups which seek to perpetuate human misery in order to profit therefrom politically or otherwise will encounter the opposition of the United States. Consistent with State Department policy and strategy in the development of this speech, it offered assistance to Europe as a whole, not to a designated portion thereof. There was no way it was expected that Stalin and the USSR would go along with the Marshall Plan or allow its satellites to accept aid. But the State Department and Marshall wanted that to be made clear to the world from Stalin's actions and not the actions of the United States. It was a calculated risk that Stalin might accept the administration's plan. I return to Ben Steele's book. Stalin could not decline an American aid offer without either loosening his grip on Eastern Europe, much of which would embrace the plan, or tightening it by denying the new governments the right to choose. The latter option would come at the cost of revealing his true aims before the world, not to liberate the territories he occupied, but to subjugate and exploit them. "We would put Russia over the barrel," George Kennan said. "Either it must decline or else enter into an arrangement that would mean the end of the Iron Curtain." The British and the French reacted immediately and positively to Marshall's speech. Along these lines, they, meaning the British and the French, invited Moscow to come to Paris to participate in three-way talks over Marshall's proposal during the week of June the 23rd of 1947. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, cynical and paranoid as usual about American proposals, initially agreed to come and participate so that the USSR would not be seen as an enemy of reconstruction and stabilization of Europe. He cabled his acceptance of this invitation on June 23rd. He also instructed the Soviet ambassadors in Warsaw, Poland, Prague, Czechoslovakia, and Belgrade, Yugoslavia, to direct the governments in those countries to participate and make their own claims. As Ben Steele points out in his book, quote, the governments in Warsaw, Poland, and Prague, Czechoslovakia each responded to Molotov's cable with enthusiasm beyond what was required or prudent. Note that Prague was the capital of Czechoslovakia. The Czech foreign minister was a non-communist, Jan Masaryk, who had served in that capacity from 1940 as part of the Czech government in exile in Britain. And in that same capacity after the war, that is foreign minister for Czechoslovakia's government, as part of the communist-dominated National Front Party until his untimely death in March of 1948, which we'll talk about shortly. In any event, Ben Steele tells us about Mr. Masaryk. Czechoslovakia's foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, son of the country's post-World War I founder, unaffiliated with any party in the coalition government, was overjoyed upon learning by radio of Molotov's decision to attend the conference. Quoting Masaryk here, Czechoslovakia is ready to cooperate completely, he cabled, in the case of creating the prerequisites for the provision of American assistance and to propose Czech projects at an appropriate time. In the interest of time, I have decided to skip most of the details of what happened next, but suffice it to say there were some diplomatic exchanges during the meetings in Paris, with Molotov expressing the USSR's concern that the Marshall Plan was an attempt on the part of the United States to impose itself on and over the sovereignty of any country that accepts aid. Early on the morning of June the 30th, that is 1947, while Molotov was still in Paris talking with French and British representatives, Stalin sent a cable to Molotov directing him to obstruct Marshall's plan from being implemented in Eastern Europe. Once Molotov received Stalin's cable, later that day, his attitude suddenly changed and he became much more harsh. Thereafter, the exchanges between the British and the French on one hand, and Molotov on behalf of the USSR on the other, became more acrimonious until Molotov stood, announcing that the Soviet Union was withdrawing from discussions. The Marshall Plan, he said, was nothing but a vicious American scheme for using dollars to buy its way into European affairs. His delegation followed him out of the hall. On July 3rd, the British and French invited 22 European countries to come to meet to cooperate in devising a collective plan for European recovery to respond to the US offer of assistance. An invitation was also sent to the Soviets inviting them to come and participate if they had changed their mind. Initially, on July 4th, the next day, the Soviets cabled the East European Communist Party leaders in the other countries, the satellite countries, telling them that they should accept the invitation to go to Paris for the purpose of showing the unacceptability of the proposal of American assistance, and after making that point, to leave the talks. Not getting the hint, the Polish and Czechoslovakians expressed sincere interest in going to Paris and participating in the talks there, with the hope of gaining American aid for their countries. This caused the Kremlin to reverse its position, and on July 4th, Molotov had cables sent to the satellites rescinding his previous instructions that they actually go to Paris and basically telling them not to go. Long story short, the Kremlin basically told the Czechs that they better not plan on going to Paris or participating in Marshall Plan assistance if they knew what was good for them. Mr. Masaryk had up until then been most vocal in his enthusiasm and hope for American aid for his country. The government at the time in Czechoslovakia, of which Masaryk was a part, was a coalition government. It was the only nominally democratic government functioning among the Eastern European countries at the time. Communists in Czechoslovakia had received 38% of the vote in the last election in May of 1946, making them the largest party in that coalition government. Its government had been mostly obedient to Moscow, with which it had preferential trading agreements. Even after receiving the cable Molotov had sent them, the Czech government was still planning to send a representative to the conference and had continued to indicate its interest in receiving Marshall Plan assistance. This news didn't set well with Stalin. On July the 9th, I hope you're following these days, this is all in short succession to one another. On July 9th, and this is still 1947, representatives of the Czech government, including Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, arrived at the Kremlin and that evening met with Stalin. He, that is Stalin, let it be known in no uncertain terms that the Czechs were not going to Paris or to participate in talks regarding the Marshall Plan. Ben Steele writes in his Marshall Plan book that at this meeting, you could announce to Paris, Stalin suggested, that it had become evident that acceptance of the invitation could be interpreted as a stroke against the USSR, in particular, since none of the Slav or other Eastern European states accepted the invitation. In closing, Stalin added, for good measure, I believe that the sooner you do that, the better. With that, the Czechs were dismissed. By their actions in withdrawing from the European discussions about the Marshall Plan and specifically instructing their Eastern European satellites not to attend or to participate in the Marshall Plan, Europe was now divided into two blocks. An Eastern Bloc under the control and domination of the Soviet Union, and the Western Bloc aligned with the United States, the Western powers, and now the Marshall Plan. I'll just mention in passing that Germany, the party which had kicked off the madness that led to the then current state of affairs, geographically straddled the line between East and West. And as I mentioned before, was split with portions of the defeated country under the control of the USSR and other portions being collectively under the control of the US, Great Britain, and France. Now let's talk a little bit more specifically about Czechoslovakia, because we have an important point to make here about how events in Czechoslovakia affected the politics in the United States in 1948. Czechoslovakia, prior to World War II, adjoined Germany on the east, was sort of enveloped by it, and was just below Poland. There was a significant German-speaking population in the area of Czechoslovakia that adjoined Germany, known as the Sudetenland. On September the 30th of 1938, Hitler, Mussolini, French Premier Edouard Daladier, and British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signed the Munich Pact, which sealed the fate of Czechoslovakia, virtually handing it over to Germany in the name of peace. That was in September of 1938. On March 15th of 1939, Hitler's forces invaded and occupied the balance of Czechoslovakia, that portion not in the Sudetenland. Czechoslovakia, a nation sacrificed on the altar of the Munich Pact. These events basically sealed the place of British Prime Minister Neville, peace in our time, Chamberlain in history, as being naive and foolish, and discredited appeasement of an aggressive dictator as an effective approach to peace. During World War II, Czechoslovakia as a country disappeared from the map of Europe, essentially being annexed into and becoming a part of Nazi Germany. In May of 1945, US forces liberated the western portions of Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet forces took and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Significantly, the Soviet army liberated Prague, the Czech capital. Both the American and Soviet troops actually vacated Czechoslovakia after the war ended and were not present physically in the country following the end of the war. The National Front government, I previously mentioned, had largely been obedient to the Soviet Union once it came into existence. As I mentioned before, the government had been formed as a result of an election in May of 1946. Now I turn to events of 1948. On February the 25th of 1948, under pressure from the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, Czech President Edvard Beneš allowed a communist-dominated government to be organized. Although the Soviet Union did not physically intervene, Western observers decried the virtually bloodless communist coup as an example of Soviet subjugation and control over the countries of Eastern Europe. So what was the significance of this event to US foreign policy? As Professor Alonzo Hamby, a Truman biographer, writes, in 1948, the final pieces of the Cold War chessboard began to fall into place. In February, Soviet-backed communists seized control of Czechoslovakia, the last remaining independent democracy in Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia was now clearly under Soviet control. This coup, as described by Westerners, re-energized the anti-communist mindset among most people in the United States and solidified the fear in the United States of communist aggression in the world and even perhaps in the United States. One other event in Czechoslovakia helped to reinforce the view that Truman held towards Stalin and the Soviets. As I previously mentioned, Jan Masaryk remained foreign minister and was the only prominent minister in the new government who was neither a communist nor a fellow traveler. This was the case even after the coup of February the 25th. With its colossal 400-foot facade of Corinthian pillars dominating Loreto Square, the 17th century Cernin Palace is the largest aristocratic mansion in Prague, the capital city of Czechoslovakia. It housed the Czech Ministry for Foreign Affairs, over which Jan Masaryk presided. At 6:30 on the morning of March the 10th, 1948, the body of Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk was found lying in the cobbled courtyard below the window of his official flat in the palace. The official line was that he committed suicide, suffering from depression and insomnia, fueled by recriminations from England and America over his decision to remain in office in the communist administration. It was claimed that reproachful telegrams were found in his room and that people who had seen him over the previous weekend had been shocked by the change in his appearance. An alternative theory is that he killed himself in protest against the communist coup. But the window would not have been easy for a man of Mazaric's build to climb out of, and suspicions hardened that he had been murdered. The police doctor who certified Mazaric's death as a suicide was himself found dead a few weeks later. Officially, yet another suicide. These events served to heighten the fear of the USSR and the threat that communism posed not only in Europe, but in the United States, and eventually, I believe, helped cause many to agree with President Truman's policy toward the United States and to reject the positions advocated by Henry Wallace and the progressives. Let's turn now to the Marshall Plan. Keep in mind that I'm juggling chronologically balls in the air here. There are a multitude of things happening that are happening at the same time as each other. So keep this in mind. This lecture is not a linear exercise. It's an exercise in back and forth and keeping in mind that there are significant things happening in parallel with one another and at the same time. So now we move back into late 1947 to begin our conversation about the Marshall Plan. This portion of our discussion anyway. On December the 19th of 1947, President Truman had sent Congress a message that followed Marshall's ideas to provide economic aid to Europe. This proposal for assistance was given the formal name of the European Recovery Program, but because of Secretary of State George Marshall's speech in June of 1947, his position as Secretary of State, and his role in the promotion and development of the program, it was commonly referred to then and now as the Marshall Plan. The legislation necessary to put the Marshall Plan into effect and to authorize expenditures in connection with the plan remained pending at the beginning of 1948. It wasn't at all clear at the beginning of the year if Truman and his administration would be able to get Congress to pass the necessary legislation. The events of late February and early March of 1948 I just described concerning Czechoslovakia, and the suspicious death of its non-communist foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, probably influenced public opinion and congressional opinions as well in considering and then acting on the Marshall Plan proposal. There were some other things that were going on during this February and March time period that I'll talk about later in this lecture that also were known to the general public and to Congress. Berlin. Well, I guess I'll talk about one of them now. While the European Recovery Plan was pending before Congress, Stalin began to put into action a plan to drive the Western Allies out of Berlin. On March 9th, the day before Jan Masaryk's death, Soviet representatives in Berlin were summoned to Moscow. They were told that Moscow needed to disrupt Allied plans to put together a Western bloc, including Germany. Now, to the extent that you can read that slide, it gives you a little bit more detail about what happened. And I'm going to get rid of my, no, I'm not going to do that. You can read that for yourself, but suffice it to say, there were things that happened when these people went to Moscow that were stirring up issues relative to Germany and specifically relative to the city of Berlin. It wasn't until June of 1948 that the blockade actually happened and the airlift started. But here we are in March, and not only is a foreshadowing of those events expressed by what the Soviets were doing, but the beginnings of their disruption of commerce into and out of West Berlin had begun. And you can see that last paragraph. This was a meeting of the Allied Control Council. The parties who were supposed to be in charge of Germany pursuant to the plan that was created at the end of the war. And the Allied Control Council, with representatives from those 4 countries, had met up until this happened. And so at this last meeting on March the 20th, here it says, the entire Soviet delegation rose and walked out. Truman later noted, in most of Germany, this act merely formalized what had been an obvious fact for some time, namely that the 4-power control machinery had become unworkable. For the city of Berlin, however, this was an indication for a major crisis. We'll come back and talk about the Berlin airlift next week. The Senate debate on the European Recovery Plan took place from March the 3rd to March the 13th, 1947. During the debate, the idea that an economic program to rebuild Western Europe, including Germany, was insufficient without some kind of military alliance between the US and Western Europe to protect it from the Soviet threat surfaced during the debate. So thoughts began to be lifted up that if we were going to assist Western Europe, which was much closer physically to the Soviet threat than we were, that somehow there needed to be a military component to our commitment to Western Europe more than what was proposed in this European recovery program. It took about a year for that idea to ferment before the NATO talks got serious. So for now, the idea of NATO is sometime down the road. It's in the future. But you can see at this point, that topic begins to be raised by what was said during the debate, in this case in front of the Senate. On March the 14th, by a vote of 69 to 17, the Senate approved a 1-year, $5.3 billion appropriation, with 31 Republicans voting for the appropriation. Remember, this was a Republican-controlled Senate. So in order to get this legislation passed, Truman, Marshall, and the Truman administration needed to have enough votes from Republicans in order to get it to pass, and they got more than enough with 31. The matter then moved to the House. Ultimately, Congress overwhelmingly passed the Economic Cooperation Act of 1948. And on April the 3rd of 1948, President Truman signed the act that became known as the Marshall Plan into law. Now, Truman and his administration had what they needed in the way of congressional approval to move forward with a plan to help Western European countries rebuild and reconstruct their damaged infrastructure and to rebuild their economies and stabilize their democratic governments. This, in spite of Republican majorities in both houses of Congress. Republican presidential aspirant, Senator Robert Taft, who we began talking about last week, led lawmakers in the Senate who opposed increased federal spending and initially expressed opposition to the Marshall Plan. But in the end, at the end of the debate, he reluctantly cast his vote to pass the legislation and authorize the spending. Taft's rival, Tom Dewey, while not in the Senate, publicly expressed his support for the Marshall Plan. The other main Republican candidate for the Republican nomination, Harold Stassen, publicly supported the Marshall Plan as well. Henry Wallace, on the other hand, almost always parroting the line of the Kremlin, attacked Marshall's proposal as an unwarranted subsidy for American exporters, one certain to polarize the world into antagonistic blocs. So you can see Marshall here laying the blame at the feet of the Truman administration instead of laying the blame at the feet of the USSR and Joseph Stalin. So now let's change the subject just a little bit, and let's talk about presidential preference polls during this early part of 1948 and public perceptions of Harry Truman. Let's move away from foreign policy. On the home front, Presidential preference poll numbers during the early months of 1948 reflected a decline in President Truman's popularity. According to Gallup poll numbers, President Truman had declined in their presidential preference poll from a 46% preference in the period December 47 to January 48 against Tom Dewey's 41% and Henry Wallace's 7%. And by now, those numbers had declined by 7 percentage points for the period March-April 1948. In that preference poll, Truman came in with 39%. Did I get that right? Actually, I don't have that date on that poll. Anyway, he came in at 39% to 47% for Dewey. I do have that, February, March. An improvement of 6% for Dewey. So up for Dewey, down for Truman, and 7%, no change for Wallace. So now let's talk about Back Porch Harry. David McCullough tells us this story. A huge stir of disapproval and ridicule, editorial indignation, jokes, cartoons, etc., erupted when Truman announced a plan to add a new balcony to the south portico of the White House so that he and his family could enjoy some outside breathing space with a degree of privacy. The balcony project was Truman's own idea, and to his extreme annoyance, it met with instant disapproval from the Fine Arts Commission, as well as a large part of the press. He was called Back Porch Harry and accused of meddling with a structure that didn't belong to him, but that he was not likely to be occupying much longer. Republicans were delighted as the Truman balcony became an overnight sensation in the press. Truman argued that the addition of a balcony would provide shade for the first floor portico, avoiding the need for awnings, and would balance the White House's south face by breaking up the long verticals created by the columns. Contemporary political cartoonists satirized the president's balcony project, suggesting that it might even cost him the 1948 presidential election. On his morning walks when approaching the White House from the south side, Truman hated the sight of the dirty awnings that the balcony would replace and the way they put the beautiful columns out of proportion. He would go ahead with his balcony, and that was that. No request was made to Congress for the $16,050.74, $170,800.33 in 2019 dollars. That was the cost of constructing the balcony. Anyway, Congress didn't have to pay for it as Truman had saved a sufficient sum from his household account. Once the balcony was completed in March of 1948, several of those who had opposed the project wrote to the president acknowledging that the balcony had in fact improved the south face of the residence. So now let's talk about the condition of the White House and Margaret Truman's piano. When the Trumans moved into the executive mansion in 1945, they found it badly in need of repair after 12 years of neglect during the Depression and war. For the first 2 years of his presidency, according to White House photographer Abby Rowe, President Truman heard ghosts roaming the halls of the second floor residence. Government agencies had expressed concern about the condition of the building, including a 1941 report from the Army Corps of Engineers warning of failing wood structure, crumbling masonry, and major fire hazards. The report was dismissed by President Roosevelt. In early 1946, during a formal reception in the Blue Room, the First Lady, Bess Truman, noticed the very large crystal chandelier overhead swaying and its crystals tinkling. The floor of the oval study above moved noticeably when walked on, and a valet was then attending the president while he was taking a bath. Truman later described a potential scenario of him in his bathtub falling through the floor into the midst of a Daughters of the American Revolution tee wearing nothing more than his reading glasses. In early 1947, a stretching chandelier in the East Room and another swaying in the Oval Study caused further alarm. Floors no longer merely creaked, they swayed. The Public Buildings Administration was asked to investigate the condition of the White House, but no action was taken until January of 1948. After the commissioner of the Public Buildings Administration, which had responsibility for the White House, noticed the Blue Room chandelier swaying overhead during another crowded reception, he and the White House architect conducted their own on-site investigation the very next day. They discovered split and gouged out beams supporting the ceiling and second floor above. He reported that the beams are staying up there from force of habit alone. The number of occupants in the second floor was restricted. Temporary fixes were made to some of the beams, and scaffolding type supports were erected throughout the first family's second floor living quarters. On January the 30th, 1948, the president received a confidential report from the Commissioner of Public Buildings warning of the imminent collapse of the second floor of the mansion. In February, Truman invited the president of the American Institute of Architects, Douglas Orr, and the president of the American Society of Civil Engineers, Richard Doherty, to make a structural survey of the safety of the White House. Their one-day investigation concluded with a report issued that same day which said the second floor structure was a fire hazard and was in danger of collapse. They recommended that the second floor should be reconstructed as soon as possible, electricity use cut to a minimum, and that further investigations be undertaken. Congress provided $50,000 for a more thorough investigation, and additional engineers and other professionals were engaged from the private sector. Walls, ceilings, and floors were opened up to provide access to the investigators. Now here's what you've all been waiting for. In June of 1948, a leg of Margaret Truman's piano crashed through the floor in her second floor sitting room and through the ceiling of the family dining room below. Investigators found the floorboards to have rotted. The main floor beam was split completely through, and the ceiling below had dropped 18 inches. The investigators determined that the west end of the second floor was sinking. The first family was relocated from the west to the east end of the floor. Steel bracing was added to support the second floor and ceilings throughout the residence. The investigation concluded that the problem was in fact a collapsing building, not just a floor, and heroic remedies would be required. That year was an election year, and the president feared that news of the collapsing White House would serve as an unflattering metaphor for his administration and his re-election. Nevertheless, as you can see from that slide, reconstruction of the White House, or at least maintenance of it, and ultimately reconstruction, was commenced, which basically took place from 1950 to 1952, which is beyond the scope of our year of study. So let's move to some of the perception problems that President Truman had. I'm calling this Truman's homies, Truman's homeboys. Harry H. Vaughan, I guess I'll put up a picture of him. Harry H. Vaughan and Harry Truman, both from Missouri, met at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1917 when both were young lieutenants in the field artillery. Lieutenant Vaughan managed to extricate Lieutenant Truman from a dressing down given by their brigade commander, and they became friends for life. In World War I, Vaughan participated in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, just as Harry Truman did. He served as a liaison officer and battery commander, and for his service in combat, he was later decorated with 2 silver stars. Vaughn returned to active duty in World War II, was injured in a plane crash in 1943, and was assigned to the staff of the Truman Committee, of which Senator Harry Truman was the chairman. Truman made Vaughn the first vice presidential military aide in history in 1945. He continued as a military aide to the president when Truman became president. Vaughn is described by David McCullough in his Truman biography as Truman's Falstaffian military aide. The Collins Online Dictionary gives the following definition of Falstaffian: of, pertaining to, or having the qualities of Falstaff, especially his robust body humor, good-natured rascality, and brazen braggadocio. So that was how David McCullough described this homeboy, Harry Vaughn, Harry Truman's military aide. It was easy for those in the press and otherwise to criticize President Truman for allowing into his inner circle someone like Vaughn, someone Falstaffian. Truman was subjected to a great deal of criticism for having a Falstaffian individual as one of what appeared to be a close advisor. Anyway, Vaughn had access. I don't want you to comment out loud because you're all muted, but what the hell do you think of that picture? I think instead of underwear that Vaughn's got on there, I think that's actually a pair of swimming trunks, but it looks like boxer shorts to me. Vaughn died in May of 1981. The following is taken from his obituary, which appeared in the New York Times. Major General Harry H. Vaughn, whose actions as confidant and aide de camp to President Truman a generation ago led to a series of national uproars. Vaughn died yesterday at DeWitt Army Hospital. He was 87 years old. Continuing with the obituary, General Vaughn's reputation ranged from that of White House court jester to national menace, depending on the severity of the storm engulfing him at a particular moment. General Vaughn traded barbs with the likes of Drew Pearson, the columnist, and Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, who accused the presidential aide of being an influence-peddling 5%er, a term applied to those who offered to get government contracts for businesses for a fee, usually 5%. The general, called to testify about his activities by a Senate committee, was reprimanded for accepting 7 home freezers as gifts for himself and high-ranking friends. When Mr. Truman was urged by Drew Pearson to dismiss General Vaughn after it was disclosed that the general had accepted a medal from the neo-fascist Argentinian government, the president retorted, and I quote, "No SOB is going to tell me who to have on my staff or in my cabinet." The remark touched off a national outburst of tongue clucking. In Mr. Truman's 8 years as vice president and then president, he and General Vaughn were the charter members of a group that met frequently to play poker, swap stories, and drink bourbon with branch water. Mr. Truman and his aide, that is Harry Vaughn, often had lunch together and followed the meal with a swim in the White House pool. Once admonished for having too much influence over President Truman, General Vaughn retorted, "The president and I discuss numerous things, but my influence over him is doubtful. I don't suppose anyone gives him more advice than I do or has less of it used." Charlie Ross was another person from home who had access and was close to President Truman. Ross and Truman had both graduated from Independence High School in 1901. Ross was the valedictorian. In that picture that you have on your screen right now, in the lower left-hand corner, as you look at the picture, The young man with the long legs with his hands folded in his lap is Charlie Ross in the senior picture there. In the very back row, the young man with his hair sort of parted in the middle with the glasses, who's third from the left in the back, is young Harry Truman. Looks like a junior high student to me, but in any event, that's the senior class. And your far right, the lady in the second row on the end is Bess Wallace. So in that graduating class was a president, a future president, a future presidential press secretary, and a future first lady of the United States. I thought you'd enjoy that being pointed out in that picture, otherwise it might escape you. In any event, where was I? So Charlie Ross. Ross was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist as the chief Washington correspondent for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. In 1945, at Truman's request, he became Truman's press secretary. He was accused by reporters of not running a tight ship in coordinating press releases, not being aware of everything going on in the presidency, not burnishing the president's image, not being aware of the needs for spot news, and being a poor public speaker. You'll notice him standing there with a cigarette in his left hand. David McCullough tells us that in 1948, among the other headaches Truman had to deal with in an election year, quoting McCullough here, Charlie Ross was in a fury because Harry Vaughn insisted on making his own announcements to the press. The soft-spoken, thoughtful press secretary and the Falstaffian military aide had come to dislike one another more and more. Ross was terrifically upset, warning there had to be a showdown. It had to either be Vaughn or himself. Despite that, General Vaughn remained on the inside until the end of the Truman presidency. Charlie Ross, probably partly brought on by his heavy smoking, died on the job of a heart attack at his desk in December of 1950. And then, not to be outdone, we have President Truman's personal physician, another man from home. Wallace Graham was born in Highland, Kansas in 1910 and moved with his family to Kansas City in 1919. He graduated from Paseo High School in 1928 and received a medical degree from Creighton in Omaha in 1935. Dr. Graham joined the U.S. Army as first lieutenant on October the 4th of 1941. He served as a medical doctor in World War II and was wounded on more than one occasion. While in Stuttgart, Germany, General Harry Vaughn, yes, the Falstaffian one, ordered Colonel Graham to come to Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, where the Big Three meeting was taking place between Churchill, Stalin, and Truman, and subsequently between Clement Attlee, the new British Prime Minister, Stalin, and Truman. In an interview, General Vaughn asked Colonel Graham if he would like to be the personal physician to the President of the United States. Graham responded that he would not because he felt the President needed a general practice physician rather than a surgeon, which is what Vaughn generally was. He needed a physician who was older and more experienced as a general practitioner. Additionally, he wanted to care for more than one person, so Wallace returned to his unit. The following day, the Falstaffian one once again summoned him, and General Vaughn then sternly reminded him that he, Wallace, was in the U.S. Army and took orders from his superior officers. Thus, Colonel Graham began his duty as personal physician to the President, and parenthetically, for the Trumans for the rest of their life. While in Potsdam, Wallace also provided medical care not only to Truman, but to Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin as well. Now to 1948 and Dr. Graham's contribution to the public's perception of President Truman and the influence and impact of his homies. David McCullough gives us the story. Wallace Graham, the president's physician, was accused of gambling in grain futures at the very time the president had denounced commodity speculation as a contributing cause of inflation. And the implications were that Graham had benefited from insider information. Though at first Graham insisted he had lost his socks in the market, he eventually admitted to the Senate hearing committee to having made a profit of $6,000 on an investment of $5,700. Nevertheless, he, like Harry Vaughn, remained on duty at the White House, and the more the press deplored their presence, the more Harry Truman dug in his heels. You can guard yourself against the wiles of your enemies, Ross observed ruefully to his assistant press secretary, Eben Ayers, but not the stupidity of your friends. So I want you to cogitate on the influence that those three fellas from home might have had on the public because of the way they and their access to President Truman were portrayed in the Republican-controlled press and by those who were not particularly favorably inclined to Harry Truman to begin with. Headaches, headaches, headaches. And now let's change the subject and add another one to the mix. Let's talk about Palestine. The British had conquered the area known as Palestine towards the end of World War I. They were given a mandate over Palestine by the League of Nations. Over the years, both the Palestinian and Jewish populations in Palestine increased substantially from what they were back in about 1920, with the Zionist Jews increasing much more percentage-wise than the Palestinians. The Jews and the Zionist Jews and the Palestinian who lived there had increasingly been in conflict with one another. And here, the mandate was modified at some point in time to identify a mandate over Jewish Palestine and the Transjordan, which was Arab Palestine. And this mandate dated back to July of 1922, and now we're in 1947, 1948. So I think I said this. No, I didn't. Britain sought to get out from under the difficulties of administering this mandate over Palestine and turned the entire matter over to the United Nations. Great Britain announced that it would withdraw from the area and terminate its mandate on May the 15th of 1948. This, in a nutshell, was the background to the situation that the United Nations, the world, and President Truman was to face. David McCullough begins his discussion of President Truman's recognition of the State of Israel with the following paragraph. The issue is complicated, baffling, and charged with emotion, explosive, as Truman said, and in the heated climate of an election year, exceedingly sensitive. Its consequences in human terms for the Jewish people, the Arab Palestinians, and its effect on Middle Eastern relations could clearly be momentous and very far-reaching. You can see there, and I'm not going to talk about this very much, this is actually the partition plan that the United Nations proposed when it adopted Resolution 181. And if you look at that map closely, if you've got it expanded large enough where you can see it, you can see that the areas in yellow are the proposed areas that would constitute the Palestinian Arab state. The areas in sort of tan, which are kind of scattered if you look at it carefully, was proposed to be the Jewish state if the United Nations partition plan had actually been the plan that went forward with regard to this area and been accepted by the conflicting parties, which clearly they have never done. So we come back to President Truman. McCullough points out that Clark Clifford, pictured with Truman on your left, and another staffer named David Niles, pictured in the slide to your right, himself Jewish, were the two strongest champions of the Jewish cause in the White House. They were both well aware of the politics of the situation, though Clifford vehemently objected to any charges then or later that the November election was the real heart of the matter, that it was all just politics to get the Jewish vote. Clifford consistently and historically denied that. Support, on the other hand, support for a Jewish homeland was, of course, extremely good politics in 1948, possibly crucial in such big states as Pennsylvania or Illinois, and especially in New York, where there were 2.5 million Jews. More important even than Jewish votes to the destitute Democratic Party could be Jewish campaign contributions. Nor was there any doubt that the Republicans stood ready to do all they could for the Jewish cause for the same reasons. But beyond the so-called Jewish vote, there was the country at large, where popular support for a Jewish homeland was overwhelming. As would sometimes be forgotten, it was not just American Jews who were stirred by the prospect of a new nation for the Jewish people. It was most of America and the American people. In April, again, 1948 now, in April, in the middle of the pressure being felt by President Truman over Palestine and the Zionist desire for a sovereign nation of their own, a Gallup poll reported Truman's approval rating at only 36%. The Republicans were ecstatic. Democrats and the liberal press were depressed. Must it be Truman? Asked the nation. Truman should quit, said the front cover of the progressive-supported New Republic. Harry Truman has none of the qualities demanded by the presidency. He was colorless, a little man with a known difficulty in understanding the printed word, was another quote. On May the 12th, 1948, Harry Truman, with the 14th of May and with the withdrawal of the British mandate on the horizon. On May the 12th, Truman convened a meeting where staff was asked to consider the issue of Palestine and the question of how to respond to the likely prospect of a declaration of a Jewish state. The staff was asked to consider those matters, at which Truman asked Clark Clifford to present the case for recognition of the anticipated Jewish state. Secretary of State George Marshall, who was also present at the meeting, was adamantly opposed to Truman's recognition of that Jewish state. As I talked, remembered Clifford, I noticed the thunder clouds gathering, Marshall's face getting redder and redder. This is just straight politics, Marshall said. I don't even understand why Clifford is here. This is not a political meeting. General, Truman answered softly, he is here because I asked him to be here. Clifford continued with his argument for recognition. At one point, Marshall broke in, speaking gravely and with all the weight of his reputation, his anger just barely in control. Clifford's suggestions were wrong, Marshall said. Domestic political considerations must not determine foreign policy. At stake was the great office of the president. Indeed, said Marshall, looking directly at Truman, if the president were to follow Clifford's advice, and if in the election in November he, Marshall, were to vote, he would vote against the president for re-election. You can imagine the reaction of those in the room when somebody with General Marshall's standing made that statement at a staff meeting. There was real fear among those working for Truman's re-election that Marshall might even resign as Secretary of State over the matter, which would have been disastrous for Truman's re-election hopes. Marshall, in fact, was the shining star in the Truman administration. Fortunately, Marshall recognized that the decision-making authority rested with the president, even if he might disagree with the decision, and Marshall did not resign in protest. Fast forward 2 days. At midnight on May the 14th, 1948, the Provisional Government of Israel proclaimed a new state of Israel. On that same date, the United States, in the person of President Truman, recognized the Provisional Jewish Government as the de facto authority of the Jewish state. De jure, or legal recognition, was extended on January 31st, 1949. The U.S. delegates to the United Nations and top-ranking State Department officials were angered that Truman released his recognition statement to the press without notifying them first. Conflict escalated the next day, not between the State Department and Truman, but between the Arabs and the Jews. On May the 15th, 1948, the first Arab-Israeli war began. President Truman had decided and acted with dispatch. His recognition of the new state of Israel came just 11 minutes after the proclamation by the Provisional Government of Israel. And there's a copy of the actual memorandum signed by President Truman on May the 14th, 1948, with his handwritten notation or changes to that statement. So was it just politics, as George Marshall in a fit of anger had proclaimed, or was something higher in purpose playing out? David McCullough writes, interestingly, Time magazine said there was immense approval in the country to Truman's recognition. An editorial in the Washington Star expressed well what most Americans felt. There is a great deal to be said against the past gyrations and topsy-turvy handling of American policy regarding Palestine, but that aspect of the situation is completely overshadowed at the moment by the swift and dramatic decision of the United States to take the lead among all nations in recognizing the new Jewish state of Israel. It is a wise decision and a heartening one. McCullough writes further with regard to Truman's attitude toward the decision. Truman had no regrets. He had achieved what he intended and had besides established a point about who, after all, was in charge of American foreign policy. Remember the politics of 1948 recommendation that Truman make it clear who was in charge of foreign policy? This he had done by making this decision and accepting the responsibility for what that meant. Returning poignantly, I think, and pointing out something about Harry Truman the man, returning to McCullough's narrative. He, Truman, felt great satisfaction in what he had been able to do for the Jewish people and was deeply moved by their expressions of gratitude then and for years to come. When the chief rabbi of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, called at the White House, he told Truman, and I'm quoting here, God put you in your mother's womb so that you would be the instrument to bring the rebirth of Israel after 2,000 years. I thought he was overdoing things, remembered Truman aide David Niles. But when I looked over at the president, tears were running down his cheeks. So what did Truman do with all the pressure that was on his shoulders? What did Harry Truman do? Did he turn tail and run? What did Harry Truman do in response to all the things that I've talked about that were happening during the first 5 or so months of sometimes in the 6th month in 1948? So I'm going to call this next part of my talk get an honorary degree, go see the people. To keep matters in some perspective on how Harry Truman must have been feeling about the loyalty of traditional Democrats to his renomination, these were the days when the dump Truman, draft Eisenhower movement was reaching its zenith. Harry Truman was down in the polls, down in the eyes of the members of the Americans for Democratic Action, former New Dealers and FDR supporters. Opposed in his every move on the foreign policy front by Henry Wallace and his supporters. Challenged as to his civil rights program by the Southern Democrats, and seemingly the butt of most journalistic jokes and cartoons. And the Republicans couldn't wait to select their nominee at their upcoming national convention, which was scheduled to start on June the 21st in Philadelphia, and get on about the task of retaking the White House in November. Did Harry Truman throw up his hands and give up? For those of you whose grandchildren have heard the story about Pete the cat, did Harry Truman turn tail and cry? Goodness, no. He got on a train and headed west to see the people. Here's what Harry Truman said in volume 2 of his memoirs about what he did. Almost unanimously, the polls taken before the 1948 Democratic Convention showed my popularity to have hit an all-time low. This was a condition that resulted from the efforts made by the American press to misrepresent me and to make my programs, politics, and staff appear in the worst light possible. The charts indicated that I had gone from an approval of somewhere around 70% after I had succeeded to the presidency to the neighborhood of 36% in the spring of '48. I never paid any attention to the polls anyway, because in my judgment, they did not represent a true cross-section of American opinion. Although the polls did not bother me personally, I was aware that some of the Democratic leaders were discouraged by the dismal picture being painted by the forecasters. I saw that the press was giving widespread publicity to the predictions that the voters would repudiate me and my administration in the fall election. And I learned from experience that false propaganda can mislead even the most intelligent and well-meaning people. I knew that I had to do something about this concerted effort of the pollsters and the Republican-controlled press to drug the populace with their statistics and propaganda. Even some of my closest friends and advisors were counseling me to change my mind about going after the nomination in July. Early in May, I had an idea, perhaps the only one that the critics admitted was entirely my own. In order to circumvent the gloom and pessimism being spread by the polls and by false propaganda in the press, I decided that I would go directly to the people in all parts of the country with a personal message from the president. It would mean riding thousands of miles by train and making talks at all hours at stops along the way where crowds could be assembled to hear the facts, but it was the only alternative. My purpose was to explain the workings of American foreign policy and the status of our domestic problems in a way that the people could understand. I also felt obliged to make clear the obstructionist role which the 80th Congress was playing. I was convinced that the average everyday American did not have the full story of what was going on, and that it was necessary for me to get out of Washington long enough to discuss the facts of the situation directly with the people. I realized, of course, that the boom for Eisenhower and the defections of the progressives and the state's writers would cut into my voting strength on election day. But I knew that it was my duty to carry forward the program that had taken the nation from the depths of the Depression to prosperity and world leadership. And I was convinced that the American people would want to have it carried forward, if only they were given the facts. And these I was determined to give them. On June the 3rd of 1948, President Truman left Washington, headed west on a non-political tour. His first stop was in Pittsburgh on the morning of the 4th. This was followed by stops in Fort Wayne and Gary, Indiana, Omaha, Boys Town, Kearney, Grand Island, and Sydney, all in Nebraska. The trip west took Truman to stops in Idaho, Washington State, Oregon, and California. On June the 12th, President Truman was awarded an honorary degree of Doctor of Laws and Letters from the University of California at Berkeley. This was where he confronted FDR's son, James Jimmy, who was one of the principals of the Dump Truman movement. As I said in my second lecture in this series, Jimmy, according to Truman biographer Robert Farrell, the president took the opportunity to set Jimmy straight regarding his involvement in the Dump Truman and draft Eisenhower movement. Your father asked me to take this job, Truman said, jabbing his right forefinger into Jimmy's chest. I didn't want it. I was happy in the Senate, but your father asked me to take it, and I took it. And if your father knew what you were doing to me, he would turn over in his grave. But get this straight. Whether you like it or not, I'm going to be the next president of the United States. With that, he dismissed Jimmy. That will be all. Good day. Truman left California and made stops in Arizona and New Mexico, Emporia, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri on his way back. He visited St. Louis on the 17th of June, crossed the Mississippi River, and headed back to Washington. He returned to Washington, D.C. on June the 18th, having made a total of 76 speeches in the cities, towns, and villages along the way. And this wasn't even his Whistlestop Campaign tour that we'll talk about next week, I hope. Truman writes in his memoirs, I had never lost the faith, as some of those around me seemed to, and I found renewed encouragement and confidence in the response that came from the crowds that gathered at all the train stops on this first tour. This is a picture of a parade in Los Angeles. They seemed glad to see me and eager to hear for themselves what I had to tell them. So now let's turn the page and talk about the Republicans to wrap up our lecture for the morning. The Republicans, nomination, contest, the Republican National Convention. Andrew Bush, in his book about the 1948 campaign, sets the stage for this chapter of the story with the following. With at least half a dozen potential candidates, Republicans had to select a standard bearer before they could take the fight to Harry Truman. Shortly after the turn of the year, as the campaign shifted into high gear, observers noticed a change in the political circumstances. Robert Taft had faltered, owing to a poor showing in recent opinion polls and a new perception by some fellow senators that his position advocating deep cuts in the European Recovery Program funds was extreme. Thomas Dewey was once again gaining in the estimation of analysts after having faltered since mid-1947 in the view of many prognosticators. In the meantime, all indications were that differences over the Marshall Plan were also exacerbating the rift or the split between Taft and Arthur Vandenberg, who's pictured there. Taft responded to Truman's State of the Union address, which we've talked about in detail previously, with a speech of his own. At the time, he was generally recognized as the de facto leader of the Republicans, or at least those of the conservative stripe. He criticized Truman for offering the people something for nothing, and further that in Truman's speech, the federal government comes forward again as Santa Claus himself, with a rich present for every special group in the United States, and for everyone else who may not be included in any special group. The same week that Taft delivered his speech, Dewey gave his own, pinning the blame for high prices on the Truman administration. Given the mixed system then in effect, state primary elections didn't really go a long way to determine the ultimate nominee, although they might be a signal of the respective strength of any given candidate. There were only 12 Republican primaries in 1948. You can look at that map and the legend to that map to show that the results were all over the board, even primaries won by people you probably never heard of. In any event, one thing I want to mention about what happened was in Oregon, it was the first ever radio debate where Stassen and Dewey were both on the ballot in the primaries there. They did a radio debate, the first one ever. The sole issue of the debate concerned whether to outlaw the Communist Party in the United States, make it illegal. Stassen, despite his liberal reputation, argued in favor of outlawing the party, while Dewey forcefully argued against it. At one point, he famously stated that, quote, "You can't shoot an idea with a gun." Most observers rated Dewey as the winner of the debate, and a few days later, Dewey defeated Stassen in Oregon. From that point forward, the New York governor had the momentum he needed to win his party's nomination. In the Gallup poll taken nationally just before the Republican National Convention convened, Dewey was ahead of the other candidates with 33%, followed by Harold Stassen with 26%. Taft trailed both MacArthur and Vandenberg in a poll with a lowly 10%. The leaders of the Republican Party were never going to get behind Stassen as the party's nominee, and it was clear that Taft wasn't electable in the general. The Republican National Convention took place from June the 21st to June the 24th at the Municipal Auditorium in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dewey was the leader in the balloting at the convention from the beginning, leading on the first ballot, but not with enough votes to get the nod. Stassen and Taft were not able to agree on much of anything that would have stopped Dewey from getting the nomination. And by the third ballot, they both threw it in the towel, and Dewey received the nomination on the third ballot by acclamation. Dewey, in turn, picked Earl Warren, the liberal governor of California, as his running mate, and the ticket was set. The governors of New York and California as running mates on the Republican ticket. Time magazine declared, "The face of the Republican Party has never appeared so photogenic, so confident, so politically winning. Barring a political miracle," Time magazine wrote, "it is a kind of ticket that could not fail to sweep the Republican Party back into power." Andrew Bush writes of the longer-term importance of the Republicans' nomination of Thomas Dewey as their nominee in 1948. This is really important stuff about the history of the United States, so I want you to wake up now and listen carefully. Here's what Bush says. Aside from the immediate importance of the nomination of Dewey, the 1948 Republican nominating contest had a broader significance for the nation and the world. Dewey's convention triumph solidified the bipartisan policy of containment, and more generally of a forward engagement against communism forged by Truman. There would be no post-war revision to isolation, no matter which major party candidate won the general election. Containment, begun by Harry Truman's Democrats, was now officially the policy of Dewey's and Vandenberg's Republicans as well. Nor was this turn short-lived. No Republican candidate opposed to an assertive strategy against communism was nominated by the GOP for the remainder of the Cold War. The domestic political implications were more clouded. If Dewey's win represented the consensus for internationalism and containment, it also meant agreement on preserving intact and perhaps even expanding the New Deal. And of course, there is much to commend this interpretation. Dewey was a Northeasterner and relatively liberal. There is no question that he was less inclined to resist the New Deal and more inclined to copy it than was Taft. There was one ironic and perhaps symbolically important thing that happened just prior to the commencement of the convention, which the Republicans should have perhaps taken as an omen of things to come in November. Throughout the Saturday before the convention was to begin, the 15-foot tall giant rubber elephant that was positioned atop the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, headquarters of the Republican National Committee, was first drenched in a thunderstorm and ended up in a supine position over the hotel's marquee. I couldn't find a picture of that. And then slowly continued to deflate until it had to be whisked away, patched up, re-vulcanized, and then replaced the following day. An omen, perhaps? That's the end of my lecture for today.
Remember that if you have a question or a comment, you can unmute yourself, or you can put a chat box message in the chat box so I can help you.
Great.
I know I went over just a little bit, but I decided it was worth it. I hope you agree.
It was a great lecture. Thank you so much. Really puts things in perspective.
Yeah, think about all these balls being in the air at the same time. This is not a linear discussion. These
You
things
did a
are,
great job.
yeah, same time, yeah.
You're a good juggler. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it because we're moving into a time that some of us can sort of begin to remember. Including, of course, the Berlin Wall and, things like that. So, kind of seeing how that and when that started, my God, that was there for a long time. So, being able to make those connections is a new world. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
David, Harry Vaughan is quite a character. When I was in Washington, D.C., the largest Presbyterian church is Alexandria Presbyterian Church, and Harry Vaughan was, although he was known for his hard drinking and poker playing, he was quite a presence in that particular church. And he had his connection with Truman, who came over and laid the cornerstone. So it's not too long ago when this old curmudgeon would come with cane down the aisle to sit in church. So, life, yes, we are, Judy, beginning to remember some of the things that happened at this time.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, you're right. Friends from home.
Right.
Anybody else before we call it a day?
Dave, this is Leanne. As a side note to the recognition of the State of Israel by President Truman, we've always heard about how President Truman was influenced by his old business partner, Eddie Jacobs. Is there any information that would shed any light on that? Did he have contemporaneous discussions with Eddie Jacobs at the time that the independence of Israel was being considered?
Eddie Jacobson was probably the most influential person in getting certain of the Zionist leaders access to President Truman when he had reached the point where he was sick and tired of hearing from them and their pressure. So Leanne, what you've heard is absolutely accurate. In the interest of time, I can't tell all of these stories or these anecdotes, but in McCullough's biography of Harry Truman, there's a fairly lengthy discussion of the whole events leading up to and the things that influenced President Truman in his ultimate decision. And it's probably correct that Eddie Jacobson probably tipped the scales, perhaps, in with respect to this, but there were many things that influenced President Truman in this final decision, not the least of which, interestingly enough, is Harry Truman's knowledge of and reading of the Old Testament and the history of the Jewish people and the fact that they had not been a sovereign nation for over 2,000 years. So interesting that I found that quote about the rabbi who came after the fact and met with President Truman and made that statement. And David Niles, who was actually Truman's administration person in charge of minority affairs. David Niles was quoted, as I said, as being present during that meeting. And he was astounded and overwhelmed emotionally when he saw Truman's face after the rabbi quit talking. And Truman was so moved by what the rabbi said about him being an instrument of the reinstatement of the Jewish state that Harry Truman had tears running down his cheek. So while there may have been some concerted domestic political motivation behind that recognition, there was more to it than that. And I think that little vignette tells us more than anything else about Harry Truman, the man, and how he was affected by the story of the Jewish people, not only historically, but by what happened to them in World War II in Europe.
David, Susan Watson here, and I just want to say I loved how you interjected little bits of trivia, like the balcony and the piano leg. That was all before any memories I had, and I guess it is comforting to have people from the Midwest around you. You know, working with you. And anyway, I will just give you this bit of trivia that when Jimmy Carter was president, he included rocking chairs, which is kind of a famous rocking chair, Brumby rockers from Marietta, Georgia, and gifted those rockers to, you know, the White House. So, and they sit on that balcony up above.
Well, the amazing thing about that whole story is that Truman just got skewered. You know, what are you doing? You're going to lose in November. Of all the audacity to make a modification to the outside of this building, yada, yada, yada. And after it was built, using money he'd saved from being such a skinflint concerning the house, the critics completely reversed their view, and that picture that I showed you was what it looked like afterwards, and they all said, "We were wrong, you were right, sorry."
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Amazing.
Dave, I really appreciate your lectures. I find that I reflect all week on what you're saying, and embarrassingly, it makes me very sensitive to how superficial my knowledge of history is.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, Randy. In order to get to the place where, a couple things. In order to get to the place where you can do what I'm doing in these lectures, it all has to be stuff that happened in the past, and someone has to have gone through the history and ferreted out what was actually happening, and then writing it down from the perspective of knowing how the story turns out. When you're in the middle of it, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know, for example, when you recognize the state of Israel, everybody said the Arabs were going to drive the Jews into the ocean, and it was going to be the end of the Jewish state. So when Truman made his decision, he didn't know militarily what was going to happen. And there were a whole lot more of those Arabs than there were of the Jews. So, you know, we know how it turned out, but on the moment when that decision was made, we didn't know. We don't know who's going to get elected this November. So we don't know how the Trump presidency, for example, is going to turn out historically. We don't know certain things that have happened, you know, from a current event standpoint. So you can't really study current events in the same way you study history. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it's not that uncommon that you could read two different historians and get different viewpoints on matters. If I had chosen, for example, to go to some left-leaning pro-communist biographer to include in my lecture stuff about Henry Wallace rather than somebody who's harder on the USSR and Wallace, I could present a little different picture, because Wallace was all about peace and kumbaya and understanding and all that sort of stuff. But from the perspective of history, it seems like to me, he clearly didn't understand the nature of Stalin and Molotov and the people that were in charge of the Soviet Union and the lengths that they would go to not only subordinate these satellite countries and their people, but what they did to their own people when they stood up to them. So you can get a different perspective depending on sometimes the texture of what you're looking at from an historical perspective. But thanks, and I'm glad you reflect on it, because I can't tell if you're all asleep
Oh, no.
when I'm talking or paying close attention. So
We are.
yeah,
We're awake. I'm awake.
good. Bill?
I have a question for you. You indicated that Marshall was a
David, I had a question about
Wendy?
how much did Truman
Wendy?
know about what the CIA was doing to stop communism?
Well, the CIA was a baby at the time. It had just been created, as I said last week, by the National Security Act that I think was passed in 1946. I don't really know in detail what they might have been up to, but the basic problem was once the Soviets got into an area, they wouldn't let us have access. So somebody would have to sneak in there, or we would have to somehow or another figure out a way to solicit a local person to act on our behalf. And I'm sure there was some of that went on, but I really haven't studied that to the extent that we might have been successful in gaining that access or information. But I don't think for the most part, from a historical perspective, we weren't able to influence events very much in that regard, other than perhaps in Germany. And in that respect, not in East Germany or in East Berlin, quite frankly. Yeah, Bill, you had something.
Yes. What was Marshall's objection to recognition of Israel?
During the war, Franklin Roosevelt had met with King Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia, had met with him on a boat out in some ocean and assured him that after the war was over, we would continue to be friends with the Arabs and we would not do anything with respect to the Jewish population to offend them. So the Arabs didn't expect us to recognize this Jewish nation once the British drew themselves out of Palestine, number one. The second thing was, because of the situation at the time, and because of the existence and the importance of oil to our economy and to the economy of Europe, he was scared to death that the Arabs would, at least the ones that had access to and the ability to extract oil and transport it, they'd cut off the supply of oil. The Jewish country of Israel had little, if anything, strategically to commend itself for. It was basically a semi-desert area and natural resources weren't really an issue. It was simply the moral issue that was involved there. So Marshall, being more of a pragmatist, was scared to death that we'd lose access to what we needed to maintain our military and our economy, which is petroleum, by recognizing the Jewish state. And I think that was, as I've read, between what Roosevelt had done in terms of his previous commitment, which Truman basically broke, and Marshall's perception of Arab oil and its importance, Marshall was scared to death that we'd put ourselves in a pickle and perhaps lose the ability to finance the Marshall Plan and help Western Europe rebuild. But you'll notice at the end of the day, Marshall did not reject Truman as president by resigning, which was extremely important politically. And I don't know whether Marshall voted in the 48 election or not, but he kept his mouth quiet publicly with respect to this issue. And I think this is one of those things I was commenting on in response to Randy's comment. We learn after the fact, when the behind the scenes stuff comes out, that this happened. I don't think this was known contemporaneously. Bill,
David,
Eckhart, you may know more than me.
David, I would just add one thing. My reading of Marshall was that his real concern was that it would drag us into the Middle East in a conflict that was not necessarily in our national interest and would bring us in generations into the Middle East. And he thought long-term that was not a good idea. I guess the only thing I would say is all of his thinking was clearly not anti-Semitic in any way. It was all other things, but that was the major concern, I think, on his part, that we would just be drug into the Middle East for generations.
Yeah,
That turned out to be right.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And I didn't make that point because it didn't come to me. But yeah, thanks, Bill.
Well, on both of those cases, he proved to be right.
Yeah.
Right.
We lost access to the oil in the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as a result of all of that, we now have more oil domestically produced, unless they all go broke, than we've ever had before. So, we were going to run out of oil, and now we've got more than we ever had before. Go figure.
As long as we're willing to live with fracking.
Yeah, as long as we're willing to live with fracking, yeah. Or perhaps some additional exploration that turns up stuff we don't know about. Well, anyway, I probably overstayed my welcome. I think some people have run off and left. I appreciate you all being here. We'll have one more stab at this next week. And not sure who won the travel trophy today, whether it was Jack Clemens coming to us from farther away than David Christensen. But anyway, thanks both of you for coming to us, being with us via Zoom from long distance.
Thank you.
All right.
Great. Thank you.